why I thought it would be smart to sit somewhere else instead of stand or sit in my normal recording places, just for a little change of scenery, would be worth the fight with June and Remy. I do not know, but perhaps it'll work out. What you can't see is that beside me, Remy and June are enacting something out of a Baroque painting. Like some David and Goliath fiction, or some like Judith beheading Holofernes fiction. Anyway, Remy just ran away, and that means the DOG is not going to be distracted anymore. So I'm going to just start reading. Chapter 7 is where we left off. Logic at the edge. And Carson begins the chapter with these lines from Augustine's Confessions. With one impulse of the heart, we only just grazed it, and sighing, left the first fruits of our spirit there, and came back to the sound of our human tongue, where words have beginnings and endings. And as I read that, of course, maybe not of course, but as I read that, I'm highly aware of what it feels like to make words with my mouth and feel my tongue in my mouth, and thinking about what in the world those beginnings and endings and the edges of parts of my mouth that make words into, or make sounds into comprehensible words, and what those two things have to do with one another. If nothing else, Carson is a master of metaphor. Yeah, okay. When I desire you, a part of me is gone. Your lack is my lack. I would not be in want of you unless you had partaken of me, the lover reasons. A hole is being gnawed in my vitals, says Sappho. You have snatched the lungs out of my chest and pierced me right through the bones, says Archaeologos. You have worn me down, grated me away, devoured my flesh, sucked my blood, mowed off my genitals, stolen my reasoning mind. Eros is expropriation. He robs the body of limbs, substance, integrity, and leaves the lover, essentially, less. This attitude toward love is grounded for the Greeks in oldest mythical tradition. Hesiod describes in his Theogony how castration gave birth to the goddess Aphrodite, born from the foam around Ouranos's severed genitals. Love does not happen without loss of vital self. The lover is the loser, or so he reckons. But his reckoning involves a quick and artful shift. Reaching for an object that proves to be outside and beyond himself, the lover is provoked to notice that self and its limits. I'm already hearing connections to the beginning of the chapter. Reaching for an object that proves to be outside and beyond himself, the lover is provoked to notice that self and its limits. From a new vantage point, which we might call self-consciousness, he looks back at what, I wonder, and sees a hole. Where does that hole come from? It comes from the lover's classificatory process. Desire for an object that he never knew he lacked is defined by a shift of distance as desire for a necessary part of himself. Not a new acquisition, but something that was always properly his. Two lacks become one. The shifty logic of the lover unfolds naturally from his ruses of desire. We have seen how lovers, like Sappho in Fragment 31, recognize Eros as a sweetness made out of absence and pain. The recognition calls into play various tactics of triangulation, various ways of keeping the space of desire open and electric. To think about one's own tactics is always a tricky business. The exegesis measures out 3 angles: the lover himself, the beloved, the lover redefined as an incomplete without, the lover himself, the beloved, the lover redefined as incomplete without the beloved. But this trigonometry is a trick. The lover's next move is to collapse the triangle into a 2-sided figure and treat the 2 sides as one circle. This is one I really wish I had my whiteboard behind me. We would be drawing right now for sure. You've got a triangle, 3 angles. One angle is called the lover himself. The other angle is the beloved. And the third angle is the lover redefined as incomplete without the beloved. The way that is written, we're missing who is doing the redefinition, or the definition and then the redefinition. She implies it's the lover itself, of course. She doesn't say. But this trigonometry is a trick. The lover's next move is to collapse the triangle. Think about collapsing a triangle. You really have lines, right? Like, not lines, like one line, but like collapsing it from this into this. The lover's next move is to collapse the triangle into a 2-sided figure and to treat the 2 sides as one circle. Seeing my whole, H-O-L-E, I know my whole, W-H-O-L-E, he says to himself. His own reasoning process suspends him between the 2 terms of this pun. It seems impossible to talk or reason about erotic black without falling into this punning language. Consider, for example, Plato's Lysis. In this dialogue, Socrates is attempting to define the Greek word philos, which means both loving and loved, both friendly and dear. He takes up the question whether the desire to love or befriend something is ever separable from lack of it. His interlocutors are led to acknowledge that all desire is longing for that which properly belongs to the desirer, but has been lost or taken away somehow. No one says how. Puns flash as the reasoning quickens. This part of the discussion depends upon an adroit use of the Greek word oikaios. I think that's right. The Greek word oikaios, which means both suitable, related, akin to myself, and belonging to me, properly mine. So Socrates addresses the 2 boys who are his interlocutors and says, desire and love and longing are directed at that which is akin to oneself. To aikeu, it seems. So if you 2 are loving friends, philoi, of one another, then in some natural way, you belong to one another. Oikeioi est. It is profoundly unjust of Socrates to slip from one meaning of oikaios, to another, as if it were the same thing to recognize in someone else a kindred soul and to claim that soul as your own possession, as if it were perfectly acceptable in love to blur the distinction between yourself and the one you love. All the lover's reasoning and hopes of happiness are built upon this injustice, this claim, this blurred distinction. So his thought process is continually moving and searching through the borderland of language where puns occur. What is the lover searching for there? A pun is a figure of language that depends on similarity of sound and disparity of meaning. It matches 2 sounds that fit perfectly together as oral shapes, yet stand insistently, provocatively apart in sense. Sort of like a line. maybe also sort of like a circle. It matches two sounds that fit perfectly together as oral shapes, yet stand insistently, provocatively apart in sense. You perceive homophony at, why can't I pronounce that word? And at the same time, see the semantic space that separates the two words. Sameness is projected onto difference in a kind of stereoscopy. There is something irresistible in that. Sameness is projected onto difference in a kind of stereoscopy. You hear both at once. Although if we're talking about projections, I suppose we see both at once, but there's something irresistible in that. Puns appear in all literatures, are apparently as old as language, and unfailingly fascinate us. Why? If we had the answer to this question, we would know more clearly what the lover is searching for as he moves and reasons through the borderlands of his desire. We do not yet have an answer. Nonetheless, we should pay attention to the punning character of the lover's logic. Its structure and its irresistibility have something important to tell us about desire and about the lover's search. We have seen how Socrates makes use of punning language to slip from one sense of oikaios, kindred, to another sense, mind, when in the Lysis, he is discussing Eros as lack. Socrates makes no attempt to conceal his wordplay here. Indeed, he draws attention to it with an uncommon grammatical usage. He deliberately mixes up reciprocal and reflexive pronouns when he addresses the two philoi, Lysis and Menezinos. That is, when he says to them, you belong to one another, he uses a word for one another that more commonly means yourselves. Socrates is playing, through words, upon the desires of the young lovers before him. Mix-up of self and other is much more easily achieved in language than in life. But somewhat the same effrontery is involved. Like Eros, puns flout the edges of things. Their power to allure and alarm derives from this. With a pun, you see the possibility of grasping a better truth, a truer meaning, than is available from the separate senses of either word. But the glimpse of that enhanced meaning, which flashes past in a pun, is a painful thing, for it is inseparable from your conviction of its impossibility. But the glimpse of that enhanced meaning, which flashes past in a pun, is a painful thing, for it is inseparable from your conviction of its impossibility. Words do have edges, so do you. The punning logic of the lover is an important piece of cogitation. The lover's puns show the outline of what he learns, in a flash, from the experience of Eros, a vivid lesson about his own well-being, being. When he inhales Eros, there appears within him a sudden vision of a different self, perhaps a better self, compounded of his own being and that of his beloved. Touched to life by erotic accident, this enlargement of self is a complex and unnerving occurrence. All too easily it becomes ridiculous, as we see, for example, when Aristophanes takes the typical lover's fantasy to its logical, circular conclusion in his myth of round people. But at the same time, a sensation of serious truth accompanies the lover's vision of himself. There is something uniquely convincing about the perceptions that occur to you when you are in love. They seem truer than other perceptions and more truly your own, won from reality at personal cost. Greatest certainty is felt about the beloved as necessary complement to you. Your powers of imagination connive at this vision, calling up possibilities from beyond the actual. All at once, a self never known before, which now strikes you as the true one, is coming into focus. It's funny, she says a self, not yourself, or the beloved self. All at once, a self never known before, which now strikes you as the true one, is coming into focus. A gust of godlikeness may pass through you, and for an instant, a great many things look knowable, possible, and present. Then the edge asserts itself. You are not a god. You are not that enlarged self. Indeed, you are not even a whole self as you now see. Your new knowledge of possibilities is also a knowledge of what is lacking in the actual. We might look for purposes of comparison at how this insight takes shape within the mind of a modern lover. In her novel, The Waves, Virginia Woolf describes a young man named Neville, watching his beloved Bernard approach him from across a garden. Something now leaves me. Something goes from me to meet that figure who is coming and assures me that I know him before I see who it is. How curiously one is changed by the addition, even at a distance, of a friend. How useful an office one's friends perform when they recall us. Yet how painful to be recalled, to be mitigated, to have one's self adulterated, mixed up, become part of another. As he approaches, I become not myself, but Neville, mixed with somebody. With whom? Bernard? Yes, it is Bernard, and it is to Bernard that I shall put the question. Who am I? Neville is less alarmed by the hole in him than are the Greek lyric poets when they record the depredations of Eros. And unlike Socrates, Neville does not resort to puns to account for his mixed-up condition. He simply watches it happen and measures off its three angles. Desire moves out from Neville himself, ricochets off Bernard, and bends back to Neville. But not the same Neville. I become not myself, but Neville mixed with somebody. The piece of himself that goes out to Bernard makes Bernard immediately familiar. Even before I see who it is, as Socrates would say, it makes Bernard oikaios. I'm going to not pronounce that the same way 2 times in a row, just or listen. Even so, Neville goes on to appraise the experience as an ambivalent one, both useful and painful. As in the Greek poets, its pain arises at that edge where the self is adulterated, and bitter verges alarmingly on sweet. Eros's ambivalence unfolds directly from this power to mix up the self. The lover helplessly admits that it feels both good and bad. Hi, Jean, I see it. I know. The lover helplessly admits that it feels both good and bad to be mixed up, but is then driven back upon the question, once I have been mixed up in this way, who am I? Desire changes the lover. How curiously. He feels the change happen, but has no ready categories to assess it. The change gives him a glimpse of a self he never knew before. Some such glimpse may be the mechanism that originally shapes a notion of self in each of us, according to some analyses. Freudian theory traces this notion to a fundamental decision of love and hate, somewhat like the ambivalent condition of a lover, that splits our souls and forms our personality. There is, at the beginning of life, in the Freudian view, no awareness of objects as distinct from one's own body. The distinction between self and not self is made by the decision to claim all that the ego likes as mine and to reject all the ego dislikes as not mine. Divided, we learn where ourselves end and where the world begins. Self-taught, we love what we can make our own and hate what remains other. Historians of the Greek psyche, notably Bruno Snell, have adapted Freud's ontogenetic picture to account for the rise of individualism in Greek society during the Archaic and early classical periods. In the view of Snell, the first formation in Greek society of a self-conscious and self-controlled human personality, aware of itself as an organic whole distinct from other personalities and from the world around it, can be traced to a moment of emotional ambivalence that splits the soul. Sappho's adjective, vlupikron, signals that moment. It is a revolution in human self-awareness that Snell calls the discovery of the mind. Blocked Eros is its trigger. Its consequence is the consolidation of a self. The love which has its course barred and fails to reach its fulfillment acquires a particularly strong hold over the human heart. The sparks of vital desire burst into flame at the very moment when the desire is blocked in its path. It is the obstruction which makes the wholly personal feelings conscious. The frustrated lover seeks the cause in his own personality. Snell's is a sensational thesis and has provoked excitement, wide dissent, and ongoing controversy. No resolution of the questions of history and historiography involved is available. But Snell's insight about the importance of bittersweet love in our lives is a powerful one, appealing to the common experience of many lovers. Neville, for example, seems to come round to the same conclusion as he ponders his love for Bernard in the waves. To be contracted by another person into a single being. How strange. Chapter 8, Losing the Edge. The self forms at the edge of desire, and a science of self arises in the effort to leave that self behind. But more than one response is possible to the acute awareness of self that ensues from the reach of desire. Neville conceives it as a contraction of the self upon itself and finds it merely strange. How curiously one is changed, he muses. He does not appear to hate the change nor to relish it. Nietzsche, on the other hand, is delighted. One seems to oneself transfigured, stronger, richer, more complete. One is more complete. It is not merely that it changes the feeling of values. The lover is worth more. It is not uncommon in love to experience this heightened sense of one's own personality. I am more myself than ever before, the lover feels, and to rejoice in it as Nietzsche does. The Greek lyric poets do not so rejoice. Change of self is loss of self to these poets. Their metaphors for the experience are metaphors of war, disease, and bodily dissolution. These metaphors assume a dynamic of assault and resistance. Extreme sensual tension between the self and its environment is the poet's focus, and a particular image of that tension predominates. In Greek lyric poetry, Eros is an experience of melting. The god of desire himself is traditionally called melter of lens. This glance is more melting than sleep or death. The lover whom he victimizes is a piece of wax, dissolving at his touch. Is melting a good thing? That remains ambivalent. The image implies something sensually delicious, yet anxiety and confusion often attend it. Viscosity is an experience that repels in its own right, in the view of Jean-Paul Sartre. His remarks on the phenomenon stickiness may cast some light on the ancient attitude toward love. An infant plunging its hands into a jar of honey is instantly involved in contemplating the formal properties of solids and liquids, and the essential relation between the subjective experiencing self and the experienced world. The viscous is a state halfway between solid and liquid. It is like a cross-section in a process of change. It is unstable, but it does not flow. It is soft, yielding, and compressible. Its stickiness is a trap. It clings like a leech. It attacks the boundary between myself and it. Long columns falling off my fingers suggest my own substance flowing into the pool of stickiness. Plunging into water gives a different impression. I remain a solid. But to touch stickiness is to risk diluting myself into viscosity. Stickiness is clinging, like a too possessive dog or mistress. Sarf's high pitch that clings like a leech, and all but irrational stickiness is a trap. Dismay at self-dilution as its analog in the ancient poet's response to Eros. Nonetheless, Sartre believes that something important can be learned from stickiness, as from a dogged mistress, wordplay, about the properties of matter and the interrelation between self and other things. So he believes that something important can be learned from stickiness about the properties of matter and the interrelation between self and other things. In experiencing and articulating the melting threat of Eros, the Greek poets are presumably also learning something about their own bounded selves through the effort to resist dissolution of those bounds in erotic emotion. The physiology that they posit for the erotic experience is one which assumes Eros to be hostile in intention and detrimental in effect. Alongside melting, we might cite metaphors of piercing, crushing, bridling, roasting, stinging, biting, braiding, cropping, poisoning, singeing, and grinding to a powder, all of which are used of Eros by the poets, giving a cumulative impression of intense concern for the integrity and control of one's own body. The lover learns as he loses it to value the bounded entity of himself. A crisis of contact, like the child's encounter with honey in Sartre's example, evokes this learning experience. Nowhere in the Western tradition is that crisis so vividly recorded as in Greek lyric verse. And literary historians like Bruno Snell claim primacy for the Archaic Age on the basis of this evidence. It is unfortunate that, in making this claim, Snell neglects an aspect of ancient experience that cuts straight across his record and might have furnished compelling testimony for his thesis, namely, the phenomenon of alphabetic literacy. Reading and writing change people and change societies. It is not always easy to see how, nor to trace out the subtle map of cause and effect that links such changes to their context. But we should make an effort to do so. There is an important unanswerable question here. Is it a matter of coincidence that the poets who invented Eros, making of him a divinity and a literary obsession, were also the first authors in our tradition to leave us their poems in written form? To put this question more pungently, what is erotic about alphabetization? This may seem not so much an unanswerable as a foolish question at first. But let us look closer into the selves of the first writers. Selves are crucial to writers. Whether or not it seems fair to ascribe to the archaic poets a, quote, discovery of mind, such as Snell outlines, undeniable evidence remains in the preserved fragments of their verses of a sensibility acutely tuned to the vulnerability of the physical body and of the emotions or spirit within it. Such a sensibility is not given voice in the poetry we have from before this period. Perhaps this is due to an accident of technology. Lyric poetry, and the sensibility typical of it, begin for us with Archilochos because his poems came to be written down. We do not know how or why, sometime in the 7th or 6th century BC. Perhaps there were many Archilochoses before him, composing oral lyrics about the depredations of Eros. Nevertheless, the fact that Archilochos and his lyric successors derived from a written tradition marks in itself a decisive difference between them and whatever was before, not just because it gives us their texts, but because it cues us to certain radically new conditions of life and mind within which they were operating. Oral cultures and literate cultures do not think, perceive, or fall in love in the same way. The Archaic Age in general, a time of change, unrest, and reordering. In politics, with the rise of the polis, in economics, with the invention of coinage, in poetics, with the study by lyric poets of precise moments in personal life, and in communications technology, with the introduction of the Phoenician alphabet to Greece. This period may be seen as one of contraction and focus. Contraction of large structures into smaller units, focus upon definition of those units. The phenomenon of alphabetization and the beginning of the spread of literacy throughout Greek society was perhaps the most dramatic of the innovations with which 7th and 6th century Greeks had to cope. The alphabet must have reached the Aegean in the course of trade by the second half of the 8th century, date of the earliest Greek examples yet found. Its dissemination was slow, and its consequences are still being analyzed by scholars. What difference does literacy make? Most obviously, the introduction of writing revolutionizes techniques of literary composition. Dennis Page summarizes the practical details of the change as follows. The principal characteristic of the pre-alphabetic method of poetic composition is dependence on a traditional stock of memorized formulas which, however flexible and receptive of additions and modifications, dictate in large measure not only the form, but also the matter of poetry. The use of writing enabled the poet to make the word, rather than the phrase, the unit of composition. It assisted him to express ideas and describe events outside the traditional range. It gave him time to prepare his work in advance of publication, to premeditate more easily and at greater leisure what he should write, and to alter what he had written. At the same time, a more private revolution is set in process by the phenomenon of alphabetization. As the audio-tactile world of the oral culture is transformed into a world of words on paper, where vision is the principal conveyor of information, a reorientation of perceptual abilities begins to take place within the individual. And an individual who lives in an oral culture uses his senses differently than one who lives in a literate culture. And with that different sensual deployment comes a different way of conceiving his own relations within his environment, a different conception of his body, and a different conception of his self. The difference revolves around the physiological and psychological phenomenon of individual self-control. Self-control is minimally stressed in an oral milieu, where most of the data important for survival and understanding are channeled into the individual through the open conduits of his senses, particularly his sense of sound, right on cue, particularly his sense of sound, in a continuous interaction linking him with the world outside him. Complete openness to the environment is a condition of optimum awareness and alertness for such a person, and a continual fluent interchange of sensual impressions and responses between the environment and himself is the proper condition of his physical and mental life. To close his senses off from the outside world would be counterproductive to life and to thought. When people begin to learn reading and writing, a different scenario develops. Reading and writing require focusing the mental attention upon a text by means of the visual sense. As an individual reads and writes, he gradually learns to close or inhibit the input of his senses, to inhibit or control the responses of his body, so as to train energy and thought upon the written words. He resists the environment outside him by distinguishing and controlling the one inside him. This constitutes at first a laborious and painful effort for the individual, psychologists and sociologists tell us. In making the effort, he becomes aware of the interior self as an entity separable from the environment and its input, controllable by his own mental action. The recognition that such controlling action is possible and perhaps necessary marks an important stage in ontogenetic, as in phylogenetic, development, a stage at which the individual personality gathers itself to resist disintegration. In the presence or absence of literary effects, the way a person regards if the presence or absence of literacy affects the way a person regards his own body, senses, and self, that effect will significantly influence erotic life. It is in the poetry of those who were first exposed to a written alphabet and the demands of literacy that we encounter deliberate meditation upon the self, especially in the context of erotic desire. The singular intensity with which these poets insist on conceiving Eros as lack. Okay. Let's see if I can do this another time. The singular intensity with which these poets insist on conceiving Eros as lack may reflect, in some degree, that exposure. Literate training encourages a heightened awareness of personal physical boundaries and a sense of those boundaries as the vessel of one's self. To control the boundaries is to possess oneself. For individuals to whom self-possession has become important, the influx of sudden, strong emotion from without cannot be an unalarming event, as it may be in an oral environment where such incursions are the normal conductors of most of the important information that a person receives. When an individual appreciates that he alone is responsible for the content and coherence of his person, an influx like Eros becomes a concrete personal threat. So in the lyric poets, love is something that assaults or invades the body of the lover to wrest control of it from him, a personal struggle of will and physique between the god and his victim. The poets record this struggle from within a consciousness, perhaps new in the world, of the body as a unity of limbs, senses, and self, amazed at its own vulnerability. That's going to be it for today. So just 2 chapters, 7 and 8. But they were long chapters. They weren't that long. We are somehow only 45 pages into this, but lots to think about there. It's dense and good. And she's smart. Anyway, more soon.